Good morning. Here for the continued final hearing in SB 2015-6. Today we are quitting at 3:30. And when shall we break for lunch? Does anyone have any calls? Have to make?
Chairperson, if the lunch could include 12:30 from 1 in that range, that would be helpful. Oh yeah,
How about 12:15?
that's perfect.
Okay, we'll break at 12:15 for lunch at 1:15. And we will be doing groundwater and surface water today.
Actually, we've made revisions to that. We're limited to, I believe, air emissions today with Mr. Feinblatt for Invenergy and Mr. Ebner for the town, as well as DOH.
And those are precisely the files I have.
Crush it.
No, I have no longer short-term memory. So, are there any administrative matters we need to take up? Do we need to deal with the Office of Energy Resources requests?
No, they'll move that as a full signature.
As a push. Very well.
Good morning. Our first witness from behalf of Invenergy is Michael Feinblatt.
I'm Michael Feinblatt.
Good morning, Mr. Feinblatt. This morning, you have been provided with exhibits 29, 30, and 31. Do you have those with you?
I do.
And is exhibit 29 your curriculum vitae?
Yes.
And do you have any revisions you feel you need to make to that today?
No.
Invenergy 30, exhibit 30 is your pre-filed direct testimony going back to June of 2017, correct?
Correct.
And your rebuttal testimony is exhibit 31, and that was filed September 1st, 2017.
That's correct.
Did you have the opportunity this morning to make some changes or corrections to those testimonies?
I did.
And you've initialed those and filed those with the board today?
Yes, I have.
And those corrections that you made, just for the notes, would you consider those technical or type?
More typographical than substantive.
And in terms of exhibits 30 and 31, this is your testimony before the energy facility siting, correct?
Correct.
And you adopted here today under sworn testimony.
I do.
Mr. Feinblatt's available for any cross-examination.
CLF has no questions for this witness.
The town has a few. Morning, Mr. Feinblatt.
Good morning.
We've met before. I'm the attorney for the town of Borough, Mike Michael. So you can kind of get the lay of the land. By agreement, what we're dealing with today, as we discussed earlier, is air emissions only. I appreciate you coming back to deal with the other issues like ammonia and hydrogen, etc. And in terms of the way I'm going to approach this, is going to be pretty basic. As long as you have your direct and your rebuttal testimony up there with you, I'm just going to start with your direct, and I'm just going to ask you some questions about it from the beginning to the end, and do the same for the rebuttal. Okay. I'd like to start with the direct on page 2. Do you have that?
I do.
And so one of the purposes, on line 9, you state that the purpose is to explain CREC's environmental impact first with respect to air. So that's going to be the primary focus of why we're here today, correct?
Correct.
Have you ever done any other work besides this project for Invenergy?
I have.
Could you tell us about it?
I've helped Invenergy look at potential renewable energy project sites. But I have not worked in any other power plant related projects.
All right, so searching for renewable energy sites and this power plant project, those are the two things? Okay. And when I say you, I mean you personally and your company, ESS?
Correct. Yep.
Have you ever testified against a power plant project?
I have not.
Have you ever testified for any other power plant projects?
I have not.
Now, on line 12, you state that you became involved as CREC's environmental project manager in 2014. Is that correct?
Correct.
And then on line 14, you note that the initial major source permit for the project was dated June 26, 2015, correct?
Correct.
And you were responsible for that?
Yes.
So am I correct then that the application for the major source permit has been pending now for over 3.5 years, but you still don't have a permit?
That's correct.
Do you know what the current status of that permit is?
Late in the year 2018, December 21st, we received an email from RIDEM, which included a preliminary draft version of the permit for our review. This is typically, RIDEM typically will provide the applicant with what they call a preliminary draft version, just to make sure that they accurately reflected the information that was presented in the application. So this version is not meant for public review. It's sort of prior to public review to make sure that the details are accurately reflected, so that when they do put it out for public review, we can be sure that those issues have already been sort of resolved. They did have a few minor comments that we responded to, and we'll actually be hand delivering our response to their comments and our red line and commented draft on the preliminary draft this morning to RIDEM.
Chairperson, this is new information to me. I'm a little bit surprised that we were not served with a copy of that. I don't know of any exception under the Access to Public Records Act that would make that a private document. I believe it's clearly covered by our earlier data request, and wonder if Invenergy would agree to provide us with a copy of both the draft permit as well as the comments that are being submitted today.
On behalf of Invenergy, we don't believe that it's covered by any of the prior data requests that have been issued. We reviewed this, and our consultants have told us that this is really sort of between DEM and, in this case, the engineers. However, we're not opposed to providing those copies.
Thank you, I appreciate it. Mr. Feinblatt, you've dealt with or you're aware that Mr. Eppner has been hired on behalf of the town to review the air emissions information, correct?
Yes.
And in fact, you're aware that he made a peer review early on in this process and pointed out some inconsistencies, suggested matters to be considered, correct?
Correct.
And that was helpful in some way, wasn't it?
Very much so. It's part of the process. I found in my experience that these major source permit applications is a very iterative process. The project is typically at a very early level of design when you submit the application, because there's typically a pretty long lead time on getting that permit. So you end up submitting the air permit application very early on in the process. So the project is undergoing change as you go. So you end up having lots of different iterations of tables, and so it's very helpful to get sort of eyes on your work as you go. And that process will ultimately happen with Ryden, but in this case, to be able to get that early on in the peer review is actually very helpful.
Don't you think it might also be helpful once we get the preliminary draft to get Mr. Edna's thoughts on that as well?
Absolutely.
How many iterations would you say the application has been through so far?
Well, we submitted the original application in June 2015, and then we submitted the modeling report at the end of October of 2015. So the application really spoke about the modeling analysis that we were going to be performing. We did not include any of the modeling results. So those results were submitted in October of 2015. And then we had the health risk assessment report ready to go at that time, but Ryden asked us to hold off because they were going to be revising their guidelines. So we ended up holding off until the revised guidelines were issued, and we submitted the health risk assessment report in January of 2016. And then we got the completeness determination from Ryden at April 15th, 2016, that requested some additional information. We subsequently submitted an addendum to the application first in September of 2016, but at that time we did not have the final configuration of the Algonquin compressor station. They were planning on doing a modification of their facility, and we wanted to make sure that our modeling and our materials included that modification. So in October of 2016, we submitted an additional addendum that included that additional information from Algonquin and then the revised multi-source modeling based on that configuration. And then we didn't submit anything else from October 2016 until we got a comment letter from Ryden in May of 2018. So it was a real long period of time between October 2016 and May of 2018 where we did not get really any solid information from Ryden on where things stood. We weren't getting any comments or data requests, and we didn't submit any new information. So in May of 2018, Ryden requested some information on, they wanted the manufacturer's specification of the equipment. There wasn't really any substantive comments, it was more just backup documentation. So we sent that in I believe early June of 2018. And then the last thing we received was this email on December 21st, 2018. So it was really that's all the submittals we've made to Ryden.
So, if I understand this process, and pardon me if I'm not knowledgeable about it, it's the first time I've dealt with it, but it seems that there's three general types of submissions that you make. One is the application itself, another is the modeling work, and the other is the health risk assessment. Do I have those three basic categories correct?
Sure.
So, could you tell me approximately how many times you revised the application?
We never revised the application, we just submitted addendums to the application.
Okay, how many addendums?
Two.
Two. And how many times did you revise the modeling?
Two. That's what the addendums are essentially for.
And how many times did you revise the health risk assessment? You mentioned the Barrville compressor station, correct?
Yes.
And the Barrville compressor station is a gas compressor station that is on the same property that is going to be developed here. A piece of it's going to be carved out, correct?
Correct.
So it's going to be hard up against this facility, correct?
Correct.
And the gas compressor station has engines in it, correct?
Correct.
And those engines give off emissions just like a power plant, correct? So, and those engines run on a fairly regular basis, correct? And so, Barrville is already dealing with air emissions from the compressor station.
Correct.
Barrville is also dealing relatively close by, within the town of Barrville, with air emissions from the Ocean State Power Facility, correct?
Correct.
In addition to ambient air, Are there any other emissions that had to go into your calculations besides the proposed power plant, the compressor station, and the Ocean State power plant?
There's also the compressor station that's adjacent to Ocean State Power, the Tennessee, it's called Tennessee.
Tennessee Gas. So you got the Algonquin compressor station and its engines, Tennessee and its engines, Ocean State Power, and the emissions from that.
Right.
And all of that is in close proximity, all within the town of Berlin.
Correct. That's the purpose of the multi-source modeling that we did, is that we model the emissions of all those facilities operating at the same time, and demonstrated that even with all those facilities operating at the same time, compliance with the standards will still be maintained.
I believe you were also responsible for portions of the application to this board, correct?
Correct.
And section 9.4 of that application says that the facility could operate for 30 to 40 years, correct?
Correct.
Mr. Feinblatt, I don't know if you were here, but the lawyer for Invenergy, Mr. Blazer, made some comment a couple hearing days ago about there being no technological reason, I'm paraphrasing, that the life of the facility would be 30 to 40 years in terms of these new turbines. Like, can you comment on that? I know some of the at-risk facilities are operating 50 plus years now. So what's the life, the useful life of those engines?
And that's not really within my area of expertise. I'm really an air permitting expert. I wouldn't say that I'm an expert at
Okay, I'll save those for Mr. Nyland. Just for point of clarification then, but in terms of your assessments, what's the period of decades that you're using for your emissions assessment?
Well, the standards are based on specified time periods. You do modeling based on 1 hour impacts, 24-hour impacts, and then annual impacts. So the modeling is just based on impacts over a calendar year, so one given calendar year, it's not a long-term assessment.
Times whatever amount of decades
So
we're
any
talking
year
about.
within that 30 years, this is what the maximum index will be.
Okay, thank you.
So Mr. Feinblatt, when you do the modeling, you're making a determination based on statistical information provided by the manufacturer primarily, correct me if I'm wrong, as to the various types of pollutants that will be coming out of these engines, correct?
Correct.
And what you're looking to do is you're looking to demonstrate that these pollutants, the concentration of these pollutants in the air above Burrillville will be less than the National Ambient Air Quality Standards, correct?
That's correct.
Now, these I'll just call them standards, if that's okay with you.
Sure.
These standards are reevaluated by the government every 5 years, correct?
Correct.
And the reason for that is because science changes, correct?
Correct.
And there are times when certain levels of these pollutants is deemed to be acceptable, and then the science changes, and it's either determined that, well, that's too high, the standard's going to have to be set a bit lower, or, you know, there's no acceptable level in the air. So that those things happen, right?
Right, new information becomes available.
Would a classic example of that be lead that was in gasoline? And when the gasoline was burned with the lead in it, you were getting lead into our air, correct?
Correct.
Eventually the government said, whoa, wait a minute, we can't have any lead in the air, it's bad. And they eliminated that, correct?
Correct.
Can you think of any other examples similar to the elimination of lead where, say within the last 10 years, there's been changes in the standards where they've either reduced it reduced the cap or eliminated its acceptability altogether?
I don't know if I can think of a specific example similar to your lead example. I think a lot of the low-hanging fruit has already been sort of taken care of. I think just in general, the regulations, I guess maybe one example would be the EPA has emission standards for non-road engines, for example. So this would be for construction equipment, equipment that actually isn't used on the road, but doesn't burn diesel fuel. They're constantly reevaluating the exhaust emission standards for those types of engines based on new information. So they started out with Tier 1, they've gone to Tier 2, Tier 3, and now they're up to Tier 4. So they continually are reevaluating as there becomes new, as fuels get cleaner and as engines become more efficient. They realize that engines such as this can achieve much lower emissions than they previously could. So that's where the constant reevaluation of standards comes in. It's technology. Fuels get better, technology, combustion technology gets better, and over time, standards should be changed to reflect that.
What about MB? Is it MTBE?
Yeah.
Is that a similar example?
Right. At one time, that was considered to be a toxic pollutant, hazardous air pollutant, I should say.
Now, if we could look at page 5, starting on line 13. The sentence says, because the New England energy market is regional, air emissions from the market must also be evaluated on a regional basis, correct?
Correct.
But would you agree with me that in addition to evaluating air emissions on a regional basis or a New England-wide basis, you should also look at air emissions on a local basis?
Correct, and that's where the modeling analysis that we completed that's required looks at emissions very much on a local basis, because you set up a receptor grid within 50 kilometers of the site, and the receptor grid is much denser the closer you are to the site. So within a kilometer of the site, you're looking at receptors that are extremely close together, and as you get further away, you space those receptors further and further out. So when you're doing your demonstration that the emissions from the plant won't exceed any of the air quality standards, the determination you're really making is really on the local level. You're evaluating what effect those emissions will have on the air quality in the local area. So that analysis, you have a macro analysis where you look at, overall how will regional emissions be affected, and that's really more based on tons. But when we're talking about on a local level, it's really about air quality, which is the concentrations of the pollutants that people will be breathing. And that's where the analysis really focuses. So this entire major source air permit application and the analysis that are associated with it is really tailored towards making sure that local air quality is maintained.
So right now at this particular site, you understand, holding aside the existing facilities that are emitting these pollutants, like the 2 compressor stations and Ocean State Power, the site that is being proposed for development is forested, correct?
Well, I wouldn't say that. There's already a compressor station there. So it's a site has already been developed.
Well, that's why I asked you to hold that aside.
But it's part of the same site.
What's going to be carved out of that site, though, is a particular lot for this property, correct?
Correct, but they're on the same site. It's not a site that's completely forested. It's a site that has a compressor station on it.
Well, the site that is going to be developed for, or if it's permitted, that's going to be developed for this power plant is forested, correct?
Correct, but it's located on a site that already has a compressor station on it. It's not a forested site. It's a site that's already been developed.
Okay, I think at this point we may just be splitting hairs, but the particular site on which this power plant will be constructed.
Footprint.
The footprint, thank you. See, that's where I need your technical expertise to help me with the language. So the footprint is currently forested.
That's correct.
And would you agree with me that from an air pollution standpoint, that a forested area will absorb CO2 and give off oxygen? Correct. And to the extent you cut down the trees in that area and the other growth in order to accommodate this facility, you'd be eliminating that ability to absorb CO2 and give off oxygen, correct?
That's true, but because this plant will result in a decrease in operation of surrounding area power plants, the overall emission levels in the area will decrease even with the removal of the trees.
Well, that may be true for the New England region. I'll give you that. That there may be what was the calculation for CO2? Maybe a less than 1% reduction region-wide, correct?
I believe that's the result of this.
But if you're looking, remember we talked just a minute ago about also looking at this on the local level, correct?
Correct.
And if you look at this for the town of Burrville, right now, the footprint is giving off oxygen, correct?
Correct.
If this is permitted, the footprint will be giving off the maximum capacity to emit, for example, for CO2 would be over 7 billion pounds of CO2 a year, correct?
Right, but all those pounds are not emitted in the local area. They're dispersed over a very wide area.
Well, they're initially emitted in that local area, correct?
They go over the local area. They're emitted in the airspace above the local area.
Yes.
But they're not breathed by the people that are living in the local area. They go over their heads. That's what the analysis shows.
Well, eventually what the analysis shows is that they go downwind, correct? And they are breathed by the people who are downwind, correct?
But not all 7.2 billion pounds. Your implication is that all 7.2 billion pounds are just impacting the local area. It's dispersed over an extremely wide area.
I think we can agree that it's dispersed, but I hope we can also agree that it's emitted in the local area, over the footprint.
Objection, asked and answered.
I guess I would say that it's not really as important as where it's emitted as where it's breathed.
I understand your understanding of what's important and what's not important, and that's your opinion and you're entitled to it. I'm asking simply for you to answer the question I asked, which is the 7.2 billion pounds will be emitted over the footprint.
Correct.
Thank you. And that's true for all of the other pollutants that are identified in both your testimony and your application to DEM, as well as was summarized in the testimony of Mr. Ebner, correct?
That's correct, but the people in that area are also breathing emissions from other power plants in the area that will operate less if the correct is operating. So I guess what I'm suggesting based on my experience is that the net effect of that will result in lower impacts in the local area.
So if you were to look at just the emissions of CO2, for example, in the local area defined as Rhode Island, okay, would you agree with Mr. Ebner, and I didn't see anything in your testimony that disagreed with him on this, that the increase in CO2 for emissions generated in Rhode Island would be an increase of about 30%?
I do not agree with that.
Okay.
Rhode Island is part of RGGI, the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, which caps CO2 emissions from power plants. And Rhode Island has a specific CO2 budget cap every year for the number of tons of CO2 that can be emitted from its power plants collectively, and that cap diminishes over time. So, by the nature of that cap, CO2 emissions from the CRC, it would be impossible for those emissions to be completely additive. There would have to be a reduction in emissions from other plants in order for Rhode Island to remain below its RGGI cap.
So
to assume a 30% increase would be assuming that Rhode Island will have the ability to just ignore the RGGI cap and just add 30% to what they're currently emitting, and that's not the case. It all has to fit within the RGGI cap.
right, so if you apply then the RGGI cap to this, what would the local increase in emissions for CO2 be for Rhode Island?
I don't have the answer to that off the top of my head, but I'll just, for example, in 2020, the CO2 allowance cap in Rhode Island is 1.8 million tons. That's the cap of allowances that will be available in 2020. Not to emit, but to purchase. So we're talking about numbers that would not allow 30% increase. I can say that for sure. I don't know the exact percentage, but I can say for sure that there would not be the ability to obtain enough allowances to increase by 30%.
So what is the plan then? I mean, if it's going to be generating 7.2 billion pounds, but that's not going to be allowed under the cap, how are you going to make it work?
Well, it's not going to be generating 7.2 billion pounds. That's the potential emissions of the facility. It'll be emitting far less than that. But again, the cap is on the number of allowances that are available, and that can be purchased that year. You can bank allowances that you've purchased in previous years. So to suggest that cap, I'm not suggesting that cap limits the CO2 emissions in that year. It just limits the number of allowances that are available. So you can bank allowances in prior years so that more than that cap can actually be emitted in that year. But in the grand scheme of things, there's only so many allowances that are available, and that number is diminishing year after year. So again, I think as a general statement, it would be virtually impossible for the CO2 emissions from power plants to increase by 30% in a given year because of their cap under the RGGI program.
Excuse me, Mr. Feinblatt, is the RGGI cap a regional cap or a state-by-state cap?
Each state is given their own cap every year. And the caps are written right into, each state has developed its own implementing regulation for RGGI. So Rhode Island has its own CO2 budget trading program regulation. And right within that regulation, it lists, at this point it only goes up to 2020, but it lists how many million tons of CO2 allowances will be available in Rhode Island each year.
And is the trading program at a regional level in terms of the ability to buy allowances?
You're only allowed to, the allowances you buy are for emissions within your state that you are located in.
And does the RGGI program have banked allowances right now?
Yes.
Okay, I'll let that stand where it is.
So what you're talking about, though, is a financial transaction that allows you to do this.
Right, to purchase the allowances.
Doesn't change the fact that the emissions are coming out. It just gives you the right to do it if you make the necessary purchases.
It's actually done after the fact, so you have to true up after each 3-year period. So you're essentially paying for the emissions that you've already incurred.
Could you speak up? I think people are having trouble hearing.
Sure.
Speak right into the mic, thanks.
So, and a little bit of this is going to be education for me. So, as I understand it, there's what's called significant impact levels for each of the criteria pollutants, correct?
Correct.
Could you tell us, please, in English if you can, what is a criteria pollutant?
The EPA has defined 6 criteria pollutants that are really the pollutants that are sort of most common from typical sources in the United States. So these are NOx, CO, SO2, particulate, lead. These are sort of the most common pollutants, and they consider those. They have deemed those pollutants to be the criteria pollutants, and those are the pollutants that the NACs apply to.
Mr. McElroy, just one more question about RGGI. Are you aware that Rhode Island's emissions have gone up over the last few years, even while we're a participant in RGGI?
I am aware of that, yes.
So how do you, the cap has been declining over a period of years. How does that square with your understanding of RGGI?
But people, again, the RGGI cap is just number of allowances you can purchase that year, but you can bank allowances that you've purchased in previous years. So power plants will purchase allowances to sort of give them the capacity to operate. And then when they don't operate, they bank those allowances for use in future years. But again, there's only so many allowances.
Right.
Eventually that will run out.
As a general statement, how do you explain that emissions from Rhode Island have increased over the RGGI period over the last few years?
Well, I think the emissions from the power plants is really more dependent on the demand for electricity. I think the CO2 emissions are a consequence of the need for the power plants. So if the emissions have gone up, it's because the power plants have run more frequently. And that's really more of a market question that I'm not really an expert at, but ultimately, a power plant operates when it's needed to operate to generate power. It's a function of the need for power in the region, more than, figuring out what their CO2 emissions is. That's sort of the consequence of their operation.
You're aware that the plan for CREC is to participate in the forward capacity auction for 2020, which would theoretically put it online about 3 years later in 2023, correct?
I'm not aware of Invenergy's plans in terms of core capacity auction.
Assume hypothetically with me that the goal of Invenergy is to get this facility up and running in 2023. How will you determine this whole RegCap situation when the numbers are not even available past 2020?
Ultimately, again, I guess my answer would be the same answer I just gave Director Coit, is that, I don't think that, and this is really more of a financial discussion than an emissions discussion, but ultimately, the plant will run based on the need for power and its ability to compete in the market, and the CO2 emissions will be a result of that. So if the plant has a competitive advantage, which allows it to run more frequently than other plants, that ability to generate will give it the wherewithal and the revenue to purchase the allowances it needs, but it doesn't work the other way around. The allowances don't drive the operation. It's sort of the other way around. You run the plant and then you purchase the allowances when you need them.
You run the plant, you emit the pollutants, then you purchase the allowances. That's basically what you're saying.
Right, but again, there are limits on the number of allowances. It's not an unlimited amount available.
Don't you need the allowances first to allow you to emit the CO2?
The way the RGGI program works, it's you actually do the accounting after the fact. It's a 3-year compliance period, and you actually have to purchase all your allowances after that 3-year period. You true up afterwards. But there are sort of interim payments you have to make. Allowance. There are certain times within the 3-year period where you have to sort of true yourself up and have a certain percentage of your total, but ultimately the final true up is after the 3-year period.
On page 8 of your testimony, starting on line 17, you discuss Invenergy's original proposal regarding burning oil, which was 30 days per year. I'm sorry, 60 days per year. And Invenergy has ratcheted that down to 30 days per year, 15 days per turbine, correct?
That's correct.
And to the best of your understanding, is Invenergy willing to agree to that as a condition to the issuance of any license?
Yeah, that'll be a requirement of the major source permit. Yeah.
So that'll be built into DEM's ER permit?
Correct.
Now, there's also, beginning on line 22, a proposed limit on duct firing in the heat steam recovery generator, correct?
Correct.
It appears that what Invenergy had originally proposed is that it would have permission to do duct firing around the clock. Line 25, 8,760 hours, correct?
Correct.
But now it's proposing that it be limited to 6,100 hours, correct?
Correct.
Which is about 250 days, something like that. If my math
That's about
is
right.
wrong.
Yep.
What is it about duct firing? How does that interplay with emissions?
Well, duct firing so within the HRSG you have, literally some additional burners that you can fire natural gas through to provide additional energy. So it sort of allows you to overfire the turbine. You get more power out of the turbine than you would without them. So it gives you kind of another level you can go to when it's needed.
And a result of that is you're generating even more emissions.
You're combusting more fuel, correct.
Which generates more emissions.
Correct.
page 10, and beginning on line 5, this paragraph that goes through line 11, take a quick look at that and refresh your recollection about that. This discusses the proposal to purchase emissions reduction credits from a facility in New York, which is about 120 miles away, correct?
That's correct.
And you state that Rhode Island, on line 7, Rhode Island is downwind from that site, so those emissions impacted Rhode Island, correct?
That's correct.
And the shutdown of that facility therefore improved air quality in Rhode Island, correct?
Correct.
But that facility was operating under a permit, correct?
Correct.
And it was not emitting more than the standards as we've defined them, correct?
Correct.
But shutting it down improves air quality downwind, correct?
Correct.
Because even if the emissions are below the standards, there's still hazardous emissions, correct?
Well, the emissions are there, but the air quality that's being breathed is protected with public health and public welfare. I mean, it's at levels which have been deemed to be safe by the EPA and Rhode Island.
I understand that, but I also understand that you're still breathing it, whether it's below the standard or not. Otherwise, how would it help improve air quality to shut it down?
I agree with your premise.
Could you look at the bottom of page 17, please? We discussed this briefly earlier. The heading on line 24 says, Town of Burrillville peer review. Do you see that?
Yes.
And it talks about the September 16, 2016 Fuss and O'Neill memo that reviewed the initial application, correct?
Correct.
And on going over to page 18 at the top, it stated that Fuss and O'Neill's memo pointed out several inconsistencies in the application, and you then later in that paragraph state that you've resolved those inconsistencies, correct?
Correct.
Then in the middle of the page, the discussion of the Department of Health advisory opinion. Do you see that? Okay, on line 11.
I do.
Beginning on line 21, you state that the Department of Health concludes that although there is epidemiological, did I say that right?
Yes.
Evidence that health effects may be associated with exposures to NO2 at levels below the NAAQS, those are the standards we've been talking about, correct?
Correct.
No other health-based standard is available for evaluating impacts of that pollutant at this time. Did I read that correctly?
Yes.
And epidemiological, scientific? Is that it?
Yeah.
And NO2 is that what you call NOx? What people
It's
call
one
NOx?
element of NOx,
One element.
nitrogen dioxide.
Okay. So we now know that the science has evolved enough so that there is evidence that there are health effects associated with exposures to NO2, even at levels below these standards. But the standards haven't yet changed, correct?
Objection, I think he's mischaracterizing Mr. Feinblatt's testimony. He said
I certainly didn't mean to do that, Mr. Feinblatt, and let me just rephrase the question. Why don't you tell me what you believe that sentence says? Because maybe I'm not doing a good job.
Well, I guess first I'd say, I mean, this whole first paragraph is really just paraphrasing what the Department of Health said. This really isn't my opinion. It's really paraphrasing them. But I think what the Department of Health was saying is, although there is some scientific evidence that there could be effects associated with exposures below the standards, they went on further to say that ultimately standards are needed to make permitting decisions, that in the absence of any change in the standards, they need to rely on the standards, and that states and the federal government should rely on the standards. So I think they're kind of having it both ways and saying that there could be effects at lower concentrations, but ultimately the standards are what we really should rely on in a case like this, because absent the standards, there's no way you can make an intelligent decision.
So basically what we're waiting for is a change in the standards to catch up with the science.
Objection.
Sustained.
Do you believe the standards will be changed for this down the road?
Over time, most standards eventually do get revised, so it's possible.
Based on the new science?
It's possible. Yeah.
Usually based on the new science?
Correct.
Objection. Asked and answered.
Love them. Good answer.
I think he said yes. And if you look at page 19, I think that's exactly what you said on lines 5 through 8. As required by the Clean Air Act, US EPA periodically conducts thorough and extensive reviews of the science upon which the NAAQS are based and the NAAQS themselves to ensure they reflect the latest scientific evidence and understanding, correct?
Correct.
By the way, going back to that, you said on page 18, that bottom paragraph, excuse me, you said this is basically a summary of what DOH says regarding the health effects on exposures below the NAAQS for NO2. Does that mean you disagree with what DOH is saying about this?
Well, as I stated at the end of that paragraph, I agree with them that standards are needed to make informed, consistent regulatory decisions.
I guess my question is, you don't have any scientific evidence to disagree that there is epidemiological evidence that health effects may be associated with exposures to NO2 at levels below the standards, do you?
That's not really within my area of expertise.
Okay. Now, if we could look at page 20, please. Beginning on line 11. Again, you're continuing to respond to DOH's advisory opinion, correct?
Correct.
And beginning on line 14, it says, the RIDOH advisory opinion states that without an in-depth research study or comprehensive health impact assessment, it is not possible to say definitively that emissions from CREC will have no impact on asthma rates or on the well-being of nearby individuals with asthma, correct?
That's what it says, yeah.
Do you disagree with that?
I agree, but I would say that the studies that we've done were comprehensive enough to come to that conclusion.
Well, you've done studies on the impacts on asthma.
We've done studies on the impact we'll have on the concentrations of particulate matter in the air. And because those concentrations will remain at levels below the standards, I believe that satisfies the conclusion that they're looking for.
I understand you're relying on the standards, but are you disagreeing with DOH when it says that without an in-depth research study, it's not possible to definitively say that the impacts of the emissions from CREC will not have an impact on asthma rates?
Again, I'll repeat what I said before. I believe we've done an in-depth research study and comprehensive health impact assessment.
You did? When you say you, do you mean ESS?
Yes.
And you're saying you did an in-depth study on the impact on people with asthma?
Yes.
Or you did?
Yeah.
It's a scientific study that your company has done about this?
No, it's the air modeling analysis for the correct project, right?
So what you did is you made an air modeling, you did an air model, and you determined what the level would be,
Yep.
and you determined that it fell under the standard. And
Correct.
so you then concluded that all is good.
Okay.
But there is no, you don't, do you believe that that's what this sentence refers to, is the modeling? Or do you think it refers to a scientific study on whether this level of emissions, even below the standards, could have an impact on asthma rates or the well-being of individuals with asthma?
I'm going to object on the basis this is DOH's if he knows what's in the mind of the author.
Well, that one.
I mean, I guess the way that DOH has worded it, you know, it's not possible to say definitively. Of course, it's not possible to say definitively. So I guess I'll agree with their statement, but I will again repeat that I believe that the study that we've done, specifically for PREC, addresses any concern about asthma rates.
In terms of the standards.
Correct.
Certainly your firm did not do a scientific study regarding the effect on asthma rates. You guys aren't doctors, right?
Right, but I guess I believe that the standards that have been set are protective of people with asthma. And by doing a study that shows that we'll maintain compliance with the standards, we've accomplished the same thing.
Lines 19 through 21, DOH also recommends that if CREC is to be built, all possible steps be taken to reduce harmful emissions and mitigate the health effects of emissions, with special consideration to individuals with asthma or otherwise impaired respiratory health. Do you see that?
Yep.
Have you, in your most recent version of your application to DEM, made a proposal with regard to additional steps that might be taken to reduce the harmful emissions and the health effects of them, with specific consideration on asthma?
Well, they recommend that all possible steps be taken to reduce harmful emissions. And again, I would argue that this permitting process and the requirement to implement best available control technology, to do a modeling analysis to show you demonstrate compliance with the standards, you know, the rigorous assessments and analysis that go along with getting a major source air permit have satisfied the bar that we've taken all possible steps to reduce harmful emissions.
Well, it says to reduce harmful emissions and mitigate the health effects of the emissions with special consideration to individuals with asthma, correct?
Correct.
So, for example, and again, I understand what you do is you run the numbers to make sure it's below the standards, correct? And you believe that solves the problem, correct?
Well, I think that satisfies our burden.
Okay, I hear what you're saying. What I'm asking you is whether or not you, as a representative of Invenergy, dealing with DEM with regard to getting this air permit, has agreed to take any step over and above running the calculation to determine whether or not you're below the standards, particularly with regard to asthma. For example, have you given any thought, for example, to funding an asthma clinic in Burrillville?
That's completely beyond my purview. I don't work for Invenergy in a capacity that would facilitate that type of a decision having to do with me.
I understand. Page 22. I think this follows up. I'm sorry, I need to start at the bottom of page 21. Line 24. It says particulate matter, parens PM, parens emissions. Let me stop there. Particulate matter, I think of it as soot. But is that, am I incorrect in that regard?
Yeah, I think that's sort of an outdated notion. I wouldn't categorize it as,
Well, can you put it in a more lay-friendly term?
I mean, these particles are extremely small. We're talking about less than 2.5 microns. And they can't even be seen by the human eye. So you literally can't see it. That's how small it is. So it's you think it's sort of a pile of dirt. That's not what we're talking about here.
Well, can you define for me particulate matter? What is particulate matter?
It's a byproduct of combustion.
But it's stuff, right?
Right. But
It's really small stuff, but it's stuff that can get in your lungs.
Correct.
Okay.
But I guess as a byproduct of the advances we've made in the quality of our fuels and the advances we've made in combustion technology, whereas we previously were talking about soot and ash, for technology like this, what we're talking about is microscopic levels that you literally can't see.
You can't see them, but they can get in your lungs and have adverse health effects if they do.
Correct.
So it says particulate matter, parens PM, emissions can contribute to asthma triggers. NOx and VOC, volatile organic compounds, do I have that correct?
Correct.
Are precursors to ozone. Ozone, also known as smog, going on to the top of page 22, line 1, is created by the chemical interaction of NOx, VOC, and sunlight. Human exposure to ozone can cause both acute or short-term and chronic or long-term health effects, primarily to vulnerable populations including children, the elderly, and people with pre-existing respiratory and cardiovascular health conditions. With the implementation of BACT is Best Available Control Technology,
Correct.
for PM emissions, and later is lowest achievable emissions rate
Correct.
for NOx and VOC emissions from the facility. All possible steps have been taken to reduce the emissions of the pollutants, which can be harmful to individuals with asthma or otherwise impaired respiratory health. Did I read that correctly?
Correct.
And do you believe that all possible steps have been taken to reduce those emissions?
I do. I mean, just for the board's benefit, when you do a best available control technology analysis, you identify every control technology that's commercially available to control the pollutant that you're focused on. And then for each of those different control technologies, you consider whether they're technically feasible for the type of source that you're working on. And then, so now you've whittled it down to the list of available control technologies that are technically feasible. And then you rank them in order of effectiveness. So first you look at the most effective technology, so the one that has the greatest control efficiency. And unless you can eliminate that for economic or energy reasons, unless there's some way to eliminate it, you're required to implement that best available control technology. If you can show that that best available control technology is too expensive to be justified for the project you're proposing, you go down to the next level. But in this case, we deem the best available control technology to be the highest level of control for every pollutant. So by that exhaustive process of going out into the marketplace and looking at permits for other facilities and identifying all the available control technologies and then analyzing them from the top most effective down to the least effective, the process really does ensure that you are implementing the best control technology that can be applied to the source that you're controlling, and also that you're minimizing emissions to the greatest extent that you can.
You're not eliminating the emissions, obviously, but you're minimizing.
Correct.
Are you saying then that when you were doing your analysis of best available control technology, you then made your choice regardless of cost?
Correct.
And would you agree with me that all possible steps to reduce the emissions, one of those steps could include not building the plant? Did you ever consider that?
Objection, argumentative.
I'll allow it.
ESS was hired to submit a major source air permit application for a facility that was being proposed. So our purview was to consider the impacts of the facility being built.
So not building the plant was not within your scope?
Correct.
Mr. Feinblatt, what year did EPA reduce the ozone standard?
Well, they last reduced it in 2007.
Could we go to page 26, please? You're discussing in the middle of the page, beginning on line 9, the Resilient Rhode Island Act. Do you see that?
Yes.
And you state, beginning on line 12, that CREC supports the Resilient Rhode Island Act's goals. The Resilient Rhode Island Act establishes a goal to achieve greenhouse gas reductions from 1990 levels by specified target dates. It states that consideration of the impacts of climate change be within the powers and duties of all state agencies. Do you see that?
I do.
And one of those state agencies that is instructed to consider the impacts of climate change and has a duty to do so is this board, correct?
Correct.
So, if I can get it, I want to make sure I get the right term. Stated earlier in your testimony that you're the CREC Environmental Project Manager, correct?
That's correct.
And the major source air permit is not the only permit that CREC needs, correct?
Correct.
Are you also responsible for example, the Title V operating permit or not?
The Title V operating permit is not required to be applied for until 12 months after the facility starts operation. So it remains to be seen whether Invenergy will hire ESS at that point to help them with the operating permit. It's not a pre-construction permit.
All right. What about the CO2 budget permit?
Similarly, that's something that's obtained much closer to actual operation. It's not required to initiate construction. At this point, we're really in the pre-construction phase of trying to get the permits to get authorized to construct.
All right,
And there's a whole other phase of permits that have to be received once you have a plant that's been constructed and is going to operate.
All right. Just going to go down the list of permits, and you can tell me which are construction-related permits and which are not. Okay. So the next one is the EPA acid rain permit.
Operation.
The DEM water diversion permit.
That's beyond my purview.
All right.
I actually don't believe that we need that at this point, but
Okay. The DEM RIP DES multi-sector general permit for industrial stormwater.
operation.
The DEM RIP DES general permit for construction stormwater.
Construction.
Is that within your purview?
With my company, yeah.
But not you?
As the project manager, I manage the experts in the various fields, so I'm involved in the process, but I'm not the one doing the technical analysis.
Do you have from an overview standpoint, do you know generally what the status of that is?
That's part of the Ryden's wetland application. When we submitted the application to Ryden for the wetlands permit, that RIPD's general construction permit was part of that application. So it's sort of at the same status point.
But what is that?
So many things going on, I'm trying to remember. We've received several information requests from Ryden, and at this point, we have an information request that we're currently working on related to the access road So it's sort of ongoing back and forth with RIDEM, trying to get the application to the point where they can put it out for public comment.
And they won't do that until it's complete.
They won't do that until we've submitted sort of our final information. Yeah.
And it hasn't been done yet.
Correct.
Would it be the same answer then for the permit to alter a freshwater wetland?
Yes.
What about the Army Corps of Engineer individual permit for wetlands? What does that say?
Similarly, it's sort of following the same track as the RIDEM wetlands application. The Army Corps is letting RIDEM take the lead at this point in terms of technical comments, and their intent, I believe, is to issue their public notice at the same time. So we're working in parallel with RIDEM and the Army Corps on getting all the details right on the wetlands applications. They put it out for public comment.
In this particular case, if there was to be a requirement for a federal environmental impact statement, that would be determined by the Army Corps, correct?
Correct.
And has the Army Corps made the decision yet in that regard?
I'm not aware whether they have or not.
Okay. Who would be aware?
They haven't. The Army Corps would be aware. They haven't not informed us one way or the other.
Either way.
No.
But if they had informed you, you would know?
Yes.
Okay.
Yep.
Just want to make sure it wasn't somebody else in ESS.
Yep. I would know.
All right, now I'm going to move on to your rebuttal testimony. I'd like to start on page 2, beginning on line 11. We're talking about the, you've reviewed Mr. Retner's direct testimony, correct?
I have.
And so you state on line 18 that he accurately lists the potential annual emissions of pollutants from the facility, and he details the possible acute and chronic health effects of each pollutant, correct?
Correct.
So you don't dispute his calculations or his description of the health effects, do you?
No.
Page 3, please. So starting on line 18, you referenced Invenergy's response to the town's data request 28-7, and you go on to state that the proposed modifications to the Algonquin compressor station were not finalized at the point you submitted this testimony. Have those modifications now been finalized?
Yes.
And you went on to say, this was an update dated June 13, 2017, correct?
Correct.
You went on to state that within 30 days of the issuance of the permit for Algonquin, RIDEM anticipated rendering a preliminary decision on the CREC permit. That's what you stated there, correct?
Right, that's right out of RIDEM's update to the EFSB status update, June 13, 2017. So those are RIDEM's words, not mine.
But that hasn't happened, has it?
No,
Do you know why?
I don't.
Have you asked RIDEM?
We've repeatedly asked RIDEM for status updates, and we really haven't gotten a definitive answer up until this December 21st email. Because, as I said before, there was a long period of time where we were getting any information provided, but we now understand that we're very close to getting that draft permit.
Do you remember, I'm not looking for an exact date, maybe a month, when the Algonquin permit revision was approved?
I believe it was in January of 2018, and they've actually already made the modifications.
So it was about a year ago, roughly.
Yes.
Page 6, please. Beginning on line 21. We're talking here about Mr. Ebner's testimony about increased truck emissions. Do you see that?
I do.
And on line, well, let me back up. You understand that during the construction period, there's going to be a whole lot of trucks going in and out of this facility for at least 2 or 3 years, correct?
Yes.
And that even after the construction phase is over, there will be more than the usual amount of trucks going into this facility because they're going to be trucking in their own water, correct?
Objection form.
You understand there's going to be a lot of trucks going into the facility because they're going to be trucking in water during operations, correct?
I wouldn't categorize the number of trucks during operation as being a large number of trucks.
Would you, is it 44 round trips a day?
Not necessarily, that would be the maximum number.
Oh.
That wouldn't be every day.
For the purposes of this question, let's assume that I'm going to ask you to identify the maximum number of trucks, 44 a day.
Sure.
Because that could happen, correct?
Good.
You got trucks for water, correct?
Yep.
So you got trucks for wastewater coming out.
Yep.
You got trucks for hydrogen tubes.
Not all of these will happen on a daily basis.
I understand, but they'll happen on a, we'll call it a regular basis, correct?
On some interval, but not all at the same time.
Demineralization trailers,
Yep.
trucks for that,
Yes.
ammonia trucks,
Yep.
other trucks related to the general operations of the plant, I would assume, correct? Deliveries, etc. Yes?
Yes.
Now, I would assume you would agree with me that these trucks are generally diesel engines that have emissions associated with them, correct?
Correct.
Not stuff you want to breathe if you can avoid it. Would you agree with me?
Yeah, I agree.
And would you also agree that unlike the emissions that are going out the stack in a power plant, the emissions coming out of the exhaust of a truck are essentially ground level, correct?
Correct.
Which means that people that are in the immediate area of where those trucks are traveling are much more likely to breathe it, correct?
Well, but a truck is also emitting an extremely low volume of air. I mean, so the actual mass of pollutant and the amount of air that's being is just on a completely different scale than if you're trying to compare it to the power plant. So I think you'd have to be extremely close to the truck. I mean, you really have to be standing in the middle of the road to really experience it.
Well, are you saying that if you lived in a house that was on the road that these trucks were going by, that you wouldn't experience breathing any of the emissions from these trucks?
What I would say is that if you're living in a house on Route 100, you're already experiencing that, and the incremental increase of at most a truck an hour is insignificant.
In your opinion?
Yes.
Do you think it's insignificant in the opinion of the people who live in those homes?
Objection.
Sustained.
So one of the things you said here on line 27 on page 6 is that the emissions would be temporary and transient in nature, correct?
Correct.
But they would be every single day, correct?
Correct.
Page 8, please. Page 8, lines 1 to 2. CREC would lead to an annual average CO2 emissions reduction of 0.95% for the New England and New York region, correct?
That's correct.
But would you agree with me that the trade-off for that is there'll be a CO2 emissions increase within the borders of the state of Rhode Island?
I don't agree with that, no.
Okay. Page 14, please. Line 16. We touched on this earlier, and we stated that the Army Corps of Engineers is the one responsible for determining whether an environmental impact statement is necessary, correct?
Correct.
And you laid out the standard here, lines 16 through 18. You say that the district engineer, I assume that's for the Army Corps, correct?
Correct.
Would need to conclude that the environmental consequences of the project have not been properly considered through the EFSB, which is this board, correct?
Correct.
Or other environmental permitting processes, and that if required, the scope of section EIS would be limited to the aspects of the project for which the USACE, the Army Corps, has control and responsibility, correct?
Correct.
And you're still waiting for them to tell you one way or another about that, correct?
Correct.
Are you at all involved in Invenergy's Lackawanna project?
I am not.
Have you been made aware of the air emissions exceedances that Lackawanna has been dealing with?
I have not.
Objection.
That's all I have then. I'm not following it up. That's all I have, thank you.
Thank you. Okay, we're going to take a 5-minute break.